I was the deacon's son. Most people outside the community don't know what that means. They don't know what a deacon is or what he does, or why the son of one would grow up knowing things that the other children never knew. But I did. I grew up in a house where certain conversations happened after supper, after the younger ones were sent to bed, in the kind of quiet that tells a child to be still and invisible and to listen. And I listened. And what I heard in those years, what I understood, slowly, as I got older, was a world operating just beneath the surface of the one that everyone else could see. My name is Jacob. I grew up Old Order Amish. I was baptized into the church, and I left a few years ago, and this channel is where I finally say the things I was raised to keep silent about. But tonight is different from the things I've told you before. Tonight is not about the general shape of Amish life. Tonight is about the inside of the machine, who runs it, how they run it, what they know that ordinary members are never told, and what happens to anyone who tries to find out. I want to be careful with every word of this because these are not abstract systems I'm describing. These are men I know, men who were kind to me in 1,000 ways, men who carried the weight of a community on their backs, men who believed with everything they had that what they were doing was right and good and ordained. I am not here to call them criminals. I'm here to tell you what I saw, as plainly and as honestly as I can, and to let you sit with it the way I have had to sit with it for years. Let me start with something that almost nobody outside ever thinks to ask. Who actually runs an Amish community? If you said the bishop, you're partly right, but you're missing something. The answer is more specific and more complicated, and the complication is exactly what they would prefer you not to understand. In an old order district, there are 3 layers of ordained leadership. At the top sits the bishop, who in German is the Bischof. He is the highest spiritual authority in his district. He interprets the Ordnung. He decides what is allowed and what is not. He performs baptisms, marriages, funerals. He holds the most authority over every family in his church district, and he holds it for life. He is not elected, not in the way the outside world would recognize. He is chosen by lot. From among the men nominated by the congregation, one is selected by chance, and the community believes that chance is God's hand. So the man who ends up as your bishop is understood to be chosen by God himself, which gives his authority a weight that no vote could ever produce. You cannot campaign against a divine appointment. You cannot ask for a recount of God's will. Below the bishop are 1 or more ministers or preachers. They preach on Sunday. They also serve as the bishop's eyes and counsel. They are chosen the same way, by lot, from among the baptized men, and they serve for life as well. No theological training, no seminary. A man who was framing houses on Saturday may be preaching to 200 people on Sunday because the lot fell to him, and that is what the lot means. And then there is the deacon. The deacon's formal title in the old German tradition is the Armen Diener, the servant of the poor. His official role is to look after the physical needs of the community, to collect alms, to distribute help to families who are struggling, to be the practical arm of the church's care. Where the bishop handles the soul and the minister handles the word, the deacon handles the money and the practical needs of everyone in his district. That sounds humble. That sounds like the least powerful of the 3. I am here to tell you that is exactly backwards, and that the gap between the official description and the actual reality is one of the things they will never put into a pamphlet for curious outsiders. My father was a deacon, and because of that, I grew up watching what the deacon actually does. The first thing is this: the deacon knows everything. He knows which families are struggling financially because they came to him. He knows which husband has a debt he has not told his wife about because the man came to him in private asking for help from the community fund. He knows which family is quietly behind on their land payment, which widow's son is trying to maneuver the farm away from her, which young couple has more children than they can feed on what their place is producing. He knows all of this because it is literally his job to know it. And because in a community with no banks and no outside insurance and no government programs they will use, the deacon and the community fund he administers is often the only place a family has to turn. So he knows everything. And here is the second thing: that knowledge is not passive. When a family situation goes before the leadership, when the bishop and the ministers and the deacon sit together to decide what should be done, the deacon is the one with the information. He is the one who can say, quietly, that this family has been struggling for 3 years, that this man has a weakness with his management of money, that this widow's situation is more complicated than it appears. The bishop sets the spiritual direction. But the deacon is the one who has sat at those kitchen tables and knows the truth behind the curtain. His information shapes every decision. And the third thing, the one that took me years to fully understand, is that the decisions made in those rooms affect things that ordinary members believe are entirely their own private business. I am going to tell you about the farm. In the community I grew up in, when a father got old enough to think about stepping back from the land, the question of who would take it over was never purely a family matter. It felt like a family matter. It looked like a family matter. The father would sit with his sons and they would talk, and eventually an arrangement would be reached. Which son would take the land, what the other sons would receive, how the widow's portion would be handled if the father died first. It had the shape of a private family conversation. But I grew up knowing that before that conversation ever happened around the kitchen table, a different conversation had already happened in a different room. My father sat with the bishop and sometimes with one of the ministers, and they talked about the family. They talked about which son was in good standing, which one had been asking difficult questions lately, which one had been seen talking to an outsider more than seemed wise, which one had a wife who was considered a steadying influence, and which one had a wife who was thought to be a little too curious about things outside the district. None of this was ever written down. None of it was ever brought to the family as a formal recommendation, but the bishop would pay a visit and he would sit with the father, and in the course of the conversation, certain things would be mentioned. A certain son's steadiness might be praised. Another son's recent difficulties, nothing specific, just a gentle acknowledgement that he had been going through a restless period, might be noted. And the father, who trusted his bishop as the voice of God in his community, would hear all of that and carry it back to his own kitchen table, where it would quietly shape the conversation he had with his sons, and neither the sons nor anyone else in the family would ever know that the shape of that conversation had been drawn in another room entirely. That is how it worked, not with commands, not with threats, with information and with the weight of spiritual authority applied at the right moment, in the right private room, by the right man. I do not know how many times my father participated in conversations like this. I know I heard the edges of some of them late at night when I was supposed to be asleep. I know that when I was about 15, a family in our district had a dispute over their land, and I know that the son who was considered to be drifting, who had been asking questions about a trade job in town, did not end up with the farm. I know that this was discussed in our kitchen before it ever came to any formal conclusion. I know that my father's voice was part of what shaped it, and I know that the son who lost out believed for years that it was simply his father's own preference. It may have been. I cannot say with certainty that the leadership's conversation caused the outcome. What I can say is that the conversation happened and the outcome followed, and the son who lost the farm never knew that room existed. I need to pause here, because this is a heavy thing to carry on your own. And if you are still with me, I want to ask you something. If you grew up anywhere, Amish or religious, or in any kind of tight community, where you suspected that decisions were being made about your life in rooms you would never be let into, go ahead and hit subscribe. This channel is where I keep saying the things I was taught to swallow, and I read every comment. You are not imagining it. You never were. Now, let me tell you about the women. I said that the deacon knows everything. I need to be more precise. The deacon knows everything that the men in the community tell him. And in the community I grew up in, the flow of information had a direction, and that direction was almost never from women to leadership, and almost always the other way around. Twice a year, before communion, the church held what we called the members' meeting, the Ordnungsgemi. Every baptized member was expected to be present, men and women both, because the purpose was to examine whether the church was at peace, whether every member was in right standing, whether there were unresolved disputes, whether anyone had broken with the ordnung in ways that needed to be addressed before the congregation could take communion together. Women were present, women were part of the membership, and their voices mattered. But the leadership of that meeting, who set the agenda, who spoke first, who brought the concerns of the community, who delivered the findings, was always the ordained men. And the deliberations of the leadership, the things that had been discussed before that meeting ever convened, the decisions that had already, in their way, been made, none of that was shared with the women of the congregation in the same way it was understood among the men. There is a word my father used sometimes when he came home from a leadership discussion. He would say it was a matter for the brotherhood to carry, and I understood, even as a boy, that the brotherhood did not include my mother. Not because she was not trusted, not because she was not respected, but because that was where the line was drawn and had always been drawn, and the line itself was never discussed, because a line that is never discussed cannot be questioned. So here is what I mean by information kept from women. I do not mean that women were locked out of every conversation. I mean that the practical management of community life, which families were receiving help from the Deacon's Fund, and how much, and for what reason, what the leadership had decided about a specific family's situation, what had been said in the deliberations before a members' meeting, what concerns had been raised about a particular young man's standing. All of this lived in a world that the women of the community were adjacent to but never fully inside. A wife might know that her husband had gone to the deacon. She might know that her family had received help. But the terms, the conditions, the things the deacon had noted in his own understanding of her family's situation, those she would not know. A woman might sense that something had been decided about her family's affairs without anyone ever sitting down with her and explaining what it was or why, and she would have no standing to ask, because the information did not belong to her in the first place, and asking too directly was its own kind of transgression. I watched my own mother navigate this. She was not a passive woman. She was sharp and observant, and she understood more than she was ever meant to. But she had spent her whole life learning to work within the shape of what she was allowed to know. And she had learned it so thoroughly that there were times I could not tell whether she was genuinely unaware of something or had simply made peace with not saying that she knew. That is what years inside that system produces, not ignorance, but a practiced and very precise silence. Now I want to tell you about the oath, because this is the one that I think about the most, and it is the reason I used the word sworn in the title of this video. Before my father was ordained as deacon, he made a promise. It was not a formal legal oath. The Amish do not swear oaths in the legal sense. They take Matthew 5:37 seriously. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. But there was an understanding among the ordained men of the district that what was spoken in leadership was not to leave those walls. Not because they were hiding something wicked, because, as my father explained it to me once, the authority of the church could not function if its deliberations were relitigated by every member who heard a second-hand version of them. The bishop needed to be able to speak plainly. The deacon needed to be able to report plainly on the families in his care. If every word of that was going to be carried home and discussed at supper tables across the district, none of it could be said honestly. That reasoning is not wrong exactly. I have turned it over many times, and I cannot say the logic is entirely without merit. Every institution that deals with private human situations has to protect the privacy of those conversations. I understand that. But here is what the oath actually produced in practice. It produced a group of men who could say anything about any family in the district with no accountability to the people they were discussing. It produced an information environment in which the people most affected by a leadership decision were the last to know it had been made and often never knew at all. It produced a system in which a family could feel the consequences of a conversation that had happened about them. A loss of standing, a shift in who was willing to do business with them, a subtle change in how the bishop spoke to them on Sunday, without ever having the right to know what had been said, who had said it, or whether any of it was true. And because the ordained men believed sincerely that their authority came from God and that their discussions were an expression of that authority, questioning the outcomes of those discussions was, in their understanding, something close to questioning God. You did not have the right to demand a review. There was no appeal. There was no written record to challenge. There was no one outside the room who could tell you what had been said inside it, because every man in that room had promised, as a matter of faith, to keep it there. That is the oath. That is what I mean when I say they swore me to keep it. Not in those words, not at any one specific moment. But I grew up as the deacon's son, and I understood from an early age that the things I overheard at the edges of my father's work belonged to a category that did not leave the house. My father did not threaten me. He didn't have to. The understanding was in the air, the way the smell of the wood fire was in the air, simply part of the world I breathed. Now let me tell you what happens when someone asks, not when someone rebels, not when someone breaks the Ordnung dramatically and gets brought before the church. I mean when an ordinary member, a farmer, a carpenter, a young married man, simply begins asking questions about how a decision was made. Why did the district rule this way about a particular matter? Why did his family's situation come out the way it did? What was said about him, and who said it, and what the basis for the conclusion was? What happens is nothing dramatic. There is no confrontation in most cases. There is no punishment pronounced. What happens is something quieter and in many ways more effective. The man who asks too many questions begins to be noticed, not mentioned. Noticed. The bishop's greeting on Sunday becomes a degree or two more formal. The minister who used to stop and talk with him after the service stops and talks for a little less time, a little less warmly, when the youth are gathering and the families are mixing at a barn raising or a wedding. He finds that the men he used to stand with in easy conversation have a slightly different quality of attention for him. Still friendly, still courteous, but with a quality of carefulness that wasn't there before. Nobody has said anything to him. Nobody has accused him of anything. But the social temperature has dropped by a few degrees, and he can feel it, even if he can't point to the moment it changed. And because he grew up in this world and knows it the way he knows the smell of rain on dry dirt, he understands exactly what that drop in temperature means. It means he has been marked, not formally, not with the weight of the band behind it, just marked, the way you mark a page in a book so you can find it again. The community has noted that this is a man who does not fully trust the leadership's judgment, and it has responded in the way it always responds to that kind of man, with patience and with a quiet, barely visible, perfectly effective turning down of the warmth. Most men, when they feel that temperature drop, correct course. They come to the deacon with a question about something else entirely, and in the course of the conversation they mention that they have been reflecting and they feel at peace now and they are grateful for the leadership's wisdom in all things. The deacon listens and nods and the temperature rises back to where it was, and nothing more is said about it. The system has done its job without anyone ever needing to do anything so crude as issue a warning. I have watched this happen. I have watched it happen to my own older brother, who asked the wrong question once at the wrong time and spent the better part of a winter navigating his way back to full warmth. He never broke the Ordnung. He never came close to the ban. He asked one too many questions, noticed the temperature drop, and quietly found his way back to standing. He would tell you today, I think, that it was not a big thing, and maybe for him it wasn't. But I watched it, and I understood it, and I stored it in the part of me that was already slowly, quietly beginning to count the cost. Let me tell you the last thing I want to say tonight, because it is the most important, and it is the one that keeps me from settling into easy anger about any of this. The men I'm describing are not calculating villains. They are not sitting in secret rooms laughing at the members they control. My father was one of the kindest men I have ever known. He carried the burdens of every family in our district in a way that genuinely cost him something. He stayed up late worrying about a widow's coal supply. He drove through ice in February to sit with a family whose barn had flooded and figure out what the community fund could do. He gave pieces of himself to people who had no one else to turn to, and he gave those pieces freely and without complaint for the better part of 30 years. He also participated in conversations that shaped people's lives without their knowledge. He also kept a silence that was sometimes, in its own way, a kind of power over the people it protected from knowing things. He also passed that silence to me, without quite meaning to, and it took me years after I left to understand that the two things, the genuine goodness and the institutional weight, came out of the same man and the same system, woven together so completely that you cannot hold one without touching the other. That is what I keep coming back to. The system is not run by bad men. It is run by good men who have been told their entire lives that the authority they hold is God's authority, and that questioning it, even gently, even honestly, even from inside, is a form of spiritual danger. They believe this. They are not pretending, and that belief makes the whole thing nearly impossible to argue with from within it, because you cannot reason someone out of a position they arrived at through faith rather than reason. You can only leave and carry what you saw with you, and try, carefully and with as much love as you can, to put it into words. There were things my father carried that were too heavy for one man. There were things he knew that no family should have had decided for them in a room they never knew existed. There were women in our district who built their lives on foundations they were never given the chance to fully understand. And there were young people, like my brother, like me, who felt the temperature drop and spent years deciding whether the cost of asking was one they could afford to pay. I paid it. I paid it in ways I am still counting. And there are pieces of what I paid that I could not put into this video. The names, the specific conversations I sat at the edge of as a boy, the night I finally understood that the silence I had been taught to keep was not protecting anyone anymore, least of all the people it was supposed to serve. I wrote those pieces down. Everything that doesn't survive on a platform like this one, the specific and the particular and the things I was sworn never to repeat, is in the book. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the first comment. Subscribe, because I am going to keep pulling the door open on the world I came from, with respect for the people inside it and without apologizing for finally learning to speak. Until next time, the questions you were told not to ask are almost always the ones that matter most. I spent half my life not knowing that. Getting there is the whole work.